Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all. One more episode for the week here on this Thursday, June 27th, 2024. Great to have you aboard the program here on the Andrew Lawton Show, Canada's most irreverent talk show. And we have an absolutely wonderful show planned for you today. I've been working on this for a little while, not because it was like this giant thing. It'll be good, but just because it was very difficult to pin down the scheduling. It seems like every week, sometimes multiple times a week, there have been more and more things where Alberta is going up against Ottawa in a very substantive way. And it oftentimes comes back to environmental policy. So that is where we're really looking at this changing relationship, this changing federalism relationship, and specifically with Alberta and Ottawa. And so at the center of it, obviously, is Alberta's Environment Minister, Rebecca Schulz, who we've had on the show in the past. She actually ran for the leadership against Danielle Smith, but has since become a very supportive and strong member of Danielle Smith's caucus. And I wanted to just do a deep dive with Minister Rebecca Schulz on this, a deep dive on how Ottawa and Alberta are going at it and how she certainly, I would assume, thinks Alberta is going to come out on head. So in about 10 minutes or so, Minister Rebecca Schulz will join me. We'll have a whole half hour with her. So if you have any questions you want me to put to Alberta's Environment Minister about Alberta's environmental policy, but in general about how provinces can assert their autonomy, please do let us know in the comments. We'll try to put a couple of those to the minister later on. Interestingly, I should just say I'm still doing, it's kind of winding down now, but I've been doing for the last few weeks the media rounds on my new book, the biography of Pierre Poilievre. So unsubtly see over my right shoulder. I think it's right for you. Yeah, it would be the right shoulder for you because otherwise the text on this would be backwards. But anyway, so I've done this, and despite my criticisms of the legacy media, they've been very gracious in having me on. I've been on CBC. I have done, believe it or not, I think 34 interviews with CBC. That is a lot of CBC interviews. I did one more yesterday. It was a CBC radio call-in show in Saskatchewan, and I did the interview. It was a lot of fun, and then the host was taking calls from people. And this is Saskatchewan. This is a province that has, I believe, every single seat being conservative. But that doesn't mean every single person is conservative. And boy, some of the callers had some strong thoughts. Not about me. They were all directing them at Poilievre. One of them I thought was going to make a compliment. They're like, well, he seems very Harperite to me. And then they followed that up with, he's a fascist. And I said, oh, okay, well, that escalated quickly. And there were a few people that had very deep concerns about his pledge to defund the CBC, which I guess is not all that surprising, given that they were listening to CBC radio in Saskatchewan when they have other great private stations like CJME, for example, that I was on a couple of weeks back. But it was a lot of fun. And I also had an event in Norwich, Ontario, and a number of listeners came out, viewers of this show. So thank you so much to those who did. It was great to meet you in person and see a couple of you again. But let's just talk a little bit more. I swear we're going to move on from the Toronto-St. Paul's by-election after this week, but I cannot overstate how significant a development this by-election was in the broader political landscape. Now, Sean, this just came up. So if you could try to get that clip of Mark Holland that one of our colleagues was sharing. This is a tremendous clip that I want to share with people. It just came like a second before we went on air. I won't give it away too much, but I will tell you that I think the NDP has been getting a little bit of a pass here because it's easy to point out how this was a grand failing for the Liberals, and it was easy to point out how Justin Trudeau absolutely just crapped the bed on this and has a coterie of cabinet ministers now coming out to pretend that everything is fine and they have great confidence in him. Meanwhile, all of these anonymous caucus members from the Liberals are blabbing to reporters at CBC, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and saying, yeah, Justin Trudeau's got to go. And that's all fine. And I think we need to have that discussion. But can we talk about how much of a profound failure Jagmeet Singh's NDP was? The NDP ran a candidate here, Amrit Parhar, who got 10.9% of the vote. 10.9% of the vote in Toronto. in Toronto. Remember, the NDP is incredibly strong provincially in provincial politics in Toronto, but federally, the NDP was an absolute non-entity in this, 10.9% of the vote. Just to give a little bit of context, in 2021, the NDP had 15.89%. Well, that's redistributed. So 15 to 16% because the boundary had changed a little bit. That was in 2021. In 2019, the NDP had 15.78%. In 2015, around 15%. And that was with Noah Richler, who's a bit of Canadian royalty. But the NDP, again, not a huge player, but a drop from 15 or so percent to what do we have again for this year? A drop from 15 to 10.9%. And I don't even know if Jagmeet Singh really... that's my book I see on the screen there. Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. Yes, that wasn't an intentional ad, but, glad you got to see it again. Jagmeet Singh did not even really campaign. Didn't even go there. I'm not even convinced that he visited the riding during the by-election. If so, I don't follow his moves really, really closely because I prefer to, pay attention to people who matter and are relevant. But he was there. And what was fascinating to me in all of this is that the NDP are the ones that I think have an opportunity here to be the principled lefties of Canadian politics. They have the opportunity to be the principled voices for all of the things that Justin Trudeau pretends he cares about and pretends to stand up for. And they don't do that. So I've heard rumblings and rumors, the kind that you always have to take with, 17,000 grains of salt, in that the NDP are really going to consider strongly, which I know sounds equivocal as it is, pulling their supply and confidence agreement by the fall. And it might even happen over the summer, but it's a bit of an empty gesture because MPs are not going to do anything until they go back to the House of Commons in the fall. But the NDP, could finally try to assert some sort of independence, some sort of autonomy, some sort of a goal here. But what's fascinating is that provincially, the NDP wants nothing to do with the NDP federally when it comes to Alberta. So Naheed Nenshi, who is the new leader of the Alberta NDP as of Saturday, has now decided to go full steam ahead on really pushing for a divorce between the Alberta NDP and the federal NDP, which right now are harmonized, where if you get a membership in one, it comes with a membership to the other. Now, Rachel Notley had not been as far left as Jagmeet Singh on a number of issues, notably energy issues, but even she never wanted to sever these two things, whereas Nenshi is looking at the Jagmeet Singh NDP brand in Ottawa and saying, this is just not at all something that we want anything to do with. So I'll talk about that in a second, but I wanted to play the Mark Holland clip because this is Mark Holland explaining why the Liberals really lost in Toronto St. Paul's.
Thank you very much. I will point out just for the record, it was not hypothetical for 40,000 people in Toronto St. Paul's on Monday. They did actually make a decision.
So let me take the first part of what you said, because you're right. People in St. Paul's made a decision and we're responding to that. But I think that people in St. Paul's knew they weren't changing a government. They were saying, we're upset at the world right now. I knocked on those doors. I didn't hear anybody saying, I love Pierre Poilievre's plan for the country, because he doesn't have one. He's reflected the anger that exists in the world. Well done. Where are people happy in the world right now? It's a tough time to be alive as a human being. So that was about frustration and being able to express it without changing governments. And I understand that. And that message is heard loud and clear. And for Terry, Dan, and I, we're going to dig deeper. I'm going to wake up in the morning and try to work harder and try to do more and try to meet the frustrations of those people with better effort and clearer communication. But, I don't think saying that they made a decision about the kind of country or government they want is at all accurate.
People are just venting. Where else are people? No one's happy. People, of course, are unhappy. It's my goodness, absolutely fascinating to me that he's so tone deaf. It's basically now everyone's unhappy. So he's doing the Poilievre thing that the Liberals criticize him for doing, of saying everything is broken in Canada. He's just, everyone's miserable. Of course, they're just venting. Everyone's just blowing off steam. It's like the boys will be boys of political punditry following a by-election loss. But to go back to the NDP for a moment, what Naheed Nenshi is saying here is that the federal NDP is not at all not at all on board with what he thinks the NDP needs to be in Alberta. And I think a lot of people in the province realized that they had their, dalliance. They had their mistake of Rachel Notley. They wanted to get away from that. And I think are probably going to take another 30 years before they do something so foolish again. And I think he realizes that the only way to exist and to be successful, if that's at all possible, is to be a more moderate party. I mean, sure, take the NDP brand and resources and history and all of that, but the NDP brand itself in Alberta needs to be separate from the NDP brand federally. So where is that leaving you in the province of Alberta? Well, remember here that what they're looking at is an NDP federally that no longer wants to be the party of the working class. It no longer wants to be, Jack Layton, I feel like I owe Jack Layton an apology in a way, because I used to, as a young rambunctious right-leaning Canadian, see him as being this, left-wing radical by virtue of leading the NDP. And now I would long for a Jack Layton to be running. I would long for a Thomas Mulcair to be running the NDP, because these folks at least had a solid understanding of the confines of political reality, of just reality in general. Nikki Ashton today, who's one of the most far-left members of Canadian politics and of the Parliament of Canada, had come out and she was doing this press conference with these self-loathing Jews at Independent Jewish Voices and saying we need to stop any charities that are putting money in towards quote-unquote colonizing Palestinians. So she basically doesn't want any Canadian charities to give money that goes to Israel at all. And not the state of Israel, but, just Israeli enterprise and Israeli humanitarian work. And I responded on Twitter. I haven't gotten a response, and I'm not really expecting one from her. Is she concerned about all the charities that are funneling money to Hamas? No, she's not, because she's so committed to this colonizee dichotomy that she views everything from. She is not interested in dealing with reality. There are far too many NDPers right now who think the biggest threat to the world is no one recognizing their they, them, zim-zir pronouns and not perhaps mobilizing as labor. So, if you're a blue-collar union worker, the NDP no longer speaks to you. And this is one of the reasons that Pierre Poilievre has had such success, because Jagmeet Singh, who again is a Rolex-wearing, Versace bag-toting Bay Street lawyer, is not the working class representative in Ottawa. He just isn't. This is the guy who out-celebrities Justin Trudeau. Was it Esquire or GQ that did the full takeout on Jagmeet Singh? I can't remember. And look, no one would put me on the cover of a magazine. It would be like the worst-selling magazine in the history of the publishing industry. So I don't fault him for it. Maybe you want to say I'm jealous that he got like the whole Jagmeet Singh centerfold. And maybe not a centerfold. I take that back. But, the whole point is he has not done a thing to advance the NDP cause. And look, I'm not a New Democrat, so you may be saying, why do I care? I care for two reasons, one of which is politically. I think our system works best when you have a voice for the left, when you have a voice for the center left and a voice for the right. I think that has historically been a good balance, but the Liberals have not been interested in being a centrist voice. They've certainly not even been interested in being a center left voice. The Liberals have pushed the NDP in so many ways, so far to the left, they don't have much wiggle room. And you see some panic online about this, where lefties are going after their own parties in the same way that some conservative-aligned people were before the merger of the Alliance and PC parties federally. And they're saying, we need to unite the left, we need to bring the Liberals and the NDP together, otherwise conservatives are going to win, and they're panicked. And they think the alternative to that is basically a two-party system where you have the left-wing party, you have the right-wing party, and we're supposedly going to have a functioning system that works in that sense. But what I'm going to be fascinated to see is what happens in Alberta, because Alberta NDP members are going to get to vote on this. Naheed Nenshi is the leader. He had a large mandate. I think it was like 85% of the vote, just absolutely massive. And this was above like former cabinet ministers in that party. So he clearly has resonated with voters. I don't know if the members are going to support this push of his, and I don't know in what numbers, because if they don't, if they say, no, we're New Democrats and we're happy to be aligned with the federal NDP, then fine, power to them. And I think they're relegated to the dustbin of history as basically an accidental government in the same way that Bob Rae's in Ontario was back in the, I guess, was it 1990, I think that election was, or 80, 88, 89, I don't know. It was around then. But then you look at the other side. If they conversely vote to sever and vote to divorce, it's a huge rebuke of the federal NDP. If you have one of the most legitimate provincial New Democratic parties, the Alberta NDP, saying to the federal NDP, we are just not that into you. So again, look, I think Liberals need to have a very serious discussion about whether their leaders is representing them well at the federal level. But New Democrats really do, because as I've said time and time again on this show, Jagmeet Singh could have been the most powerful player in Canadian politics for the last 2 years or so, the last 2.5 years. He could have been tremendously effective if he were a person that had a more solid head on his shoulders and knew what he was doing. He could have wielded tremendous power, but has chosen not to. And still, he could. I mean, better late than never. He could, if he wants, force an election, but then he would be resigned to accept that Canadians don't particularly want him. And I think the Toronto-St. Paul's by-election is just as much a wake-up call for the NDP as it is for the Liberals. But as I said, I wanted to do something very special on this show. I want to talk about, it'll start with Alberta versus Ottawa in a lot of ways. But if you're not from Alberta, I want you to pay attention, because there's a bigger story here about how provinces can assert their own autonomy and assert their own sovereignty. And I think we've seen in the last year in particular, more and more provinces get a little bit more emboldened in this sense. Not just on pushing on the parental rights discussions like we saw in New Brunswick and Alberta and Saskatchewan and for a moment in Ontario, but pushing back against Ottawa's encroachment on provincial domain and provincial territorial sovereignty. And just yesterday, we spoke to Christine Van Gyn from the Canadian Constitution Foundation about the Federal Court of Appeal case going on this week as the government federally defends its plastics ban. And you have provinces saying, like, it's not even about whether the ban is good or not. You don't have the right to do this. You don't have the right to snap your fingers and say this is a criminal law matter just because you don't want people to be able to use straws that aren't going to disintegrate within 5 seconds when they go out for lunch or dinner at a restaurant. So one of the provinces that has been leading the way, not just on pushing back against this, but a number of other similar encroachments from the feds, has been Alberta. And so much of this comes down to environmental policy. I thought it would be great to do a deep dive with Alberta Environment Minister Rebecca Schulz. Minister, good to have you back on the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, it's great to see you again.
We've been trying to set this up for weeks, and you're so busy because the federal government basically keeps giving you things that you need to fight them on. So I'm glad we were able to get a bit of time today. Just before we get into the plastics ban, I wanted to ask you about the budget, because putting in the federal budget this ban on oil and gas companies touting their environmental records is, I think, particularly disgraceful, because you don't even really get to debate this policy in isolation. I remember when people first started talking about it and they say, oh, Bill C-59, and you look up C-59 and like, well, this has nothing to do with oil and gas. This is a budget implementation bill. But what the government is doing is effectively what Charlie Angus was mocked for proposing a few weeks ago, which is saying that oil and gas companies should be treated like tobacco companies effectively and banned from talking about what they're doing well. Explain what the effect of that would be in your province, but in Canada generally.
Yeah, and I was actually just going to joke. It's a good thing that it took us a little bit longer to set up this interview, because now we get to talk about Bill C-59.
Yeah, now we have more material to work with.
Oh my gosh, it's honestly, it is the topic that everybody wants to talk about. And this week I had a meeting with the Calgary Chamber of Commerce and a number of their members, and just a roundtable. And I can tell you that C-59 was the topic of conversation. And you're exactly right. There wasn't a lot of conversation about it because it was snuck in there this as an amendment. And when MP Charlie Angus raised essentially his private member's motion, I think people did. They laughed it off like, this isn't going to be something that happens in Canada. And that's exactly what this is. This is a gag order, not just on energy, on any business that wants to talk about their environmental record. And it is, I think, because of the outrage that we've seen from some of the NGOs, and I would say the more radical left, this is exactly what they were trying to do with this amendment. And so it really does put industry and businesses in a position where they're not able to talk about their true record or their true facts. in the public without risk of massive fines, $15 million. And obviously there are concerns around a percentage of their revenues, which is a massive risk for industries. But it's not just energy. This is a major risk for agriculture. I would say, when we have a federal environment minister that says, we're not going to build any more roads, I think anybody in transportation should be highly concerned. But really, this impacts any and all industries that are working to do the right thing for the environment, that just a couple of whether it be more folks on the more radical eco left or certain NGOs can bring these challenges forward just because they don't like the record that a company is sharing. And I think when we look here in Alberta, we do tend to talk a lot about energy because we're very proud of our energy production here. But the facts are that while production goes up to meet Canadian and global demand for energy, that demand is rising every single day. We're also proud of our environmental record, that emissions intensity is going down. So that's per barrel emissions in the oil sands. They've been down over 20%. When we look at our methane emissions, those have been reduced by 45%. We were able to do that 3 years ahead of schedule. We worked with industry. We took a different approach than the federal government. We saved industry $600 million as we worked to roll that out. Electricity emissions are down. And again, overall emissions are down while demand and production rise. That is a success story. And that is a story that, quite frankly, the Trudeau Liberals, but I also say it's not just one person. This is the entire NDP Liberal coalition that is seeking to shut down voices that don't fit the narrative that they believe in. And that is a problem. Last week being in Washington, I was asked, do you not have a protection of freedom of speech in your constitution? That's an embarrassing place to be as a country, and that should be really concerning for Canadians.
Yeah, you're fielding questions as though you're some delegate from some tin pot dictatorship, and that's the way that our allies to the south are looking at us here. And just to put this in context, Pathways Alliance, which is a group that I think some energy advocates have always criticized Pathways Alliance for being not pro-energy enough, which is funny because it is an industry representative group. They shut down their website because they don't believe that they will be compliant with C-59 because their whole thing is touting the environmental achievements of the oil and gas sector. And it's amazing because there isn't even in this a defense of truth, which in any other free speech case, you could always lean on the defense of truth. It's not even like these companies are given the benefit of the doubt in that sense with what the government is doing here, where if they can verify the claims, it's fine because no one is disputing the actual facts of it. They're just saying, I don't want oil and gas to tell a positive story.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, I think we see that. Even when we were talking about our methane emissions reduction, of course, there was a group out of Carleton University supported by an anti-fossil fuel NGO that was really quite critical of our numbers. And look, we're very proud of our work on methane emissions reduction, but also our methodology for measuring and reporting that is more transparent than the vast majority of places around the world. We're proud of that record. And so, of course, it wasn't just one group, it wasn't just Pathways, but oil sands per barrel emissions intensity is down. So for every barrel that they're producing, those emissions have gone down by, I believe it's 21%, and more to come on that front. But it's not just them. The Business Council of Alberta, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Chamber of Commerce, again, not just energy companies saying that this is problematic, but there was even a Liberal Trudeau-appointed senator who said, look, we've got some issues here. We don't have enough information about how this is going to work to actually put this through. That said, they rammed it through, obviously, the House and the Senate anyways. But because there's so much uncertainty right now about what this looks like, what this actually means for these businesses, what the process is going to be, companies have investors, they have shareholders. There's, a lot of uncertainty. And the government of Canada has come out and said, okay, now we're going to consult on maybe what that's going to look like. This has massive implications for our businesses in a variety of industries. Like I said, yeah, sure, it's a gag order. This is censorship, absolutely. But these, again, this is just another policy in a long list of policies that are driving investment out of Canada.
I'm wondering if there is any concern that you've heard from other industries that feel it might not stop with them. I mean, obviously, Charlie Angus liked to compare oil and gas to big tobacco, but I think you could easily see, the food services industry, for example, be targeted with something quite similar.
Yeah, and I'm writing down as you ask the questions because you touched on the comparison to big tobacco. Like, that is wildly disingenuous. People cannot live without oil and gas. We definitely can to Canada. Like, think about that. Think about what that looks like in the middle of winter, when we're at -40 and beyond. Like, people can't live without it. We also can't live our day-to-day lives without things that have been produced by oil and gas or the petrochemical industries. Everything from our cell phones, everything to the tools needed to do medical procedures. Like, this would shut down our entire lives and quite frankly would risk people's not just well-being, it's like health and safety. This would be a life or death situation if we actually did shut down fossil fuels, which is what those folks are looking to do. It has been raised with me, though, to your point, the agriculture industry. I mean, was it just a year ago or 2 years ago now? The bad policies from the Liberals are endless. But, when they were seeking to limit fertilizer use, yeah, sure, of course, they're coming after agriculture. I mean, again, Minister Guilbeault saying we're not going to build any more roads. You better believe transportation is next. Manufacturing. What happens when auto manufacturers are targeted, right? Like, I mean, it's one thing for this to be a conversation, and it's starting here in Alberta. We did a lot of work to flag this. Our energy industry and other industries have come out in opposition to it, but like they're not going to stop at energy. This is going to impact, I would say, almost all areas of our economy, and it should be pretty concerning.
Let me ask you, if I can, about the plastics ban too, because it's easy to focus on the silliness of this. I know Premier Danielle Smith did a photo op with a big long plastic straw. I had done one up a couple of weeks earlier, and I just drank out of 20 straws at once because to celebrate the federal court striking down the plastics ban. But it's not just about straws, and it's also about something far more fundamental, which is the federal government trying to rewrite or reinterpret the Constitution for its own ideological convenience. And I know Alberta is fighting this in court. As it stands now, the ban has been defeated, but who knows what will happen at the Federal Court of Appeal or at the Supreme Court. But is this not one of the most insidious examples of the government really trying to just make up the Constitution on the fly?
Absolutely. And I mean, I've raised that with Minister Guilbeault, and certainly our Premier has raised that on a number of different occasions. I mean, you have a federal government. I actually love how Premier Smith talks about it. She says we have a federal government that is acting lawlessly, because they are. They're acting like the Constitution. It doesn't impact them. Like, they don't have to follow it.
And just to interject there for a moment, Minister, I recall when the Sovereignty Act was proposed, you had a lot of critics in academia and from the Liberals that were saying it was Alberta that was doing the end run around the Constitution, when really it's the exact opposite. The Sovereignty Act is a response to the feds doing end runs around the Constitution on a regular basis.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so, I would say we definitely see it in plastics, but we also see it in policies like the emissions cap, the Impact Assessment Act. And so, certainly with where the courts have come out on this plastics legislation and the Impact Assessment Act, I mean, I have some hope for where we're headed now, given that the courts have said, look, this is unreasonable and unconstitutional. Unfortunately, we have a federal environment minister who told me when I raised those rulings from the court, he said, those aren't decisions, those are just opinions. Opinions of the highest courts in our country, sure. But, then you have the complete and utter mixed messages coming from the federal Liberals again, that, you have, I think, it was safe to say everybody was really excited to see Dow make a final investment decision for a petrochemical facility in Alberta. Minister Wilkinson and Freeland were there, yay, we want to see this investment. We wanted it to come to Canada. And yet you have Minister Guilbeault bringing through this plastics legislation that creates so much uncertainty about that plastic circular economy. that's a problem. That is completely a contradictory message. And that plastics legislation, we were obviously very vocal against it alongside a number of the colleagues and a number of the companies and other provinces. We're happy to see that investment come here. We want to see a plastics circular economy. That's actually good. When people are recycling and we can take plastic waste and turn it into new materials, that's actually an environmental win. And that is what is at risk with Stephen Guilbeault's plastics legislation. And so that's where, again, it's completely ideological and ignores common sense and the reality of what's actually happening out here. And I think that's where you hear the frustration from people across the country, but also provinces, and of course from the business community that we're seeing.
Speaking of Minister Guilbeault, one of the things that you mentioned NGOs and a lot of these eco-radicals before. I mean, I don't know if they've ever had one of them as the Environment Minister, which I think very much applies to, Guilbeault, given his longstanding track record as an activist and protester, and one who was criminally arrested for his displays. But you've called, and the Premier has called for him to be fired. So obviously that doesn't suggest that there's a rosy relationship that you have. But do you actually speak to him? Do you have a relationship with him? And have you had any success with him on any file?
I would say, of course, we have conversations, and I imagine we'll be meeting again this summer. I have talked publicly about our meeting, when we were at COP, and Minister Guilbeault was unwilling to share information on the oil and gas emissions cap. That when I asked for details on that cap, his response was that I should sign an NDA and that he couldn't actually give me details of something that was about to be announced 48 hours later. That is not how this federal-provincial relationship is supposed to function. And again, like when you have this federal government that is just so very utterly and completely disregarding the laws of our country, we have no choice but to defend ourselves. That said, we still have to have conversations about areas where there is overlap. And, I think the challenge is that, you have a conversation. We view the world, I think, in very different ways. And ultimately, we have, despite the fact that we have provided data, and I'll use clean electricity, but the oil and gas emissions cap would be the same. The work on methane would be the same, that we have officials in both of our departments working to share information, to, look at data that, what do we actually know? Look at socioeconomic impacts of these proposed policies. The problem is we still have a minister that says, okay, well, sure, those are your numbers, but I'm going to make this decision anyways, regardless of job impacts, economic impacts, very real environmental impacts, I would say, in those cases. So we continue to meet. We have discussions. Is there any area where, we've come to agreement on? I would say we had a relatively positive conversation about oil sands mine water. We're very committed to addressing those concerns. I also raised concerns I had with politicians, I would say, making a political spectacle of something like water, which impacts people they're really concerned about. We have some of the safest, highest quality drinking water in the country in these areas. And so, I did ask for him to ensure that he's not sharing misinformation and being honest and open with communities while we have conversations about some of the bigger issues we need to tackle. I would say maybe some issues around drought. We had some good conversations where we really were keeping the federal government up to speed on the situation and what things were looking like here. But again, we have a Minister of Environment who is not, I would say it's not even a partisan thing. It's that he is an environmental activist and he is making decisions that put his ideology ahead of the well-being of Albertans and Canadians that we were respectively elected to represent. And that, I think, is bad for democracy.
Yeah, and on the big picture issues, you don't have an ally in Ottawa. And just to go back to the federalist relationship here, ideally, the federal government, the national government, and provinces are supposed to be partners rather than provinces being subordinated to the federal government. And that's why, the federal government doesn't have a veto over provincial laws. And what was so tremendous about this is that the federal government has often acted, this current one and past ones as well, as though they're really the father, if you will, and they're the ones that get to parent the provinces, and they do it in a very disingenuous way. I mean, just as recently as a few weeks ago, the government was saying no, the emissions cap isn't going to cut oil and gas production, and then I think it was just last week you get a report from Deloitte saying, oh well, actually, as everyone but the federal government acknowledged, yes, it will.
Yeah. And that's not the first report. I mean, the Deloitte.
No, it's the third, isn't it?
It's the third report. And
Yeah.
so, again, and I mean, I've been asking Minister Guilbeault, do some analysis. Do you have any economic or socioeconomic analysis on the impacts of these policies that you're bringing through? And, he has discredited the analysis that we have provided, that others have provided, like SNP and the work that CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, had done, which really covers more the conventional side. Again, there have been others, and his response is, well, that doesn't really take in. We haven't even rolled out what our policy is going to be, so that doesn't take into account where we're going to set this cap at. I mean, come on. They've been talking about what this emissions cap is going to look like. That also supports our concern that they haven't shared any information. They're not having real conversations with either provinces or industry. And, again, like if you're going to have a conversation, you have to have the conversation with the area that has jurisdiction, which is the provinces, whether that be on clean electricity regulations, where we have the responsibility to ensure that our residents have access to safe, affordable, reliable electricity. Same thing on an oil and gas emissions cap. This will impact production. There is absolutely no question that as global demand continues to rise, we want to meet that demand with our environmentally responsible, I would say socially responsibly produced energy. We want to meet those demands. We're going to continue to do that. And at some point, your emissions cap is without question going to impact production. And so I think, and Canadians are concerned. I mean, we see it across the country. You see it a lot when it's in relation to the carbon tax, that I think people right across Canada see that this government has ignored the very real concerns and basic needs of Canadians and have put this environmental ideology at the forefront. And I think, many have said this is one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation since the National Energy Program. I mean, that's big. This has massive impacts on us as a country. And, at the beginning, we talked a little bit about me being in Washington and the trade relationship that we have with the U.S. I mean, we provide the U.S. with almost 60% of their oil imports. So not only are we meeting Canadians' needs, we're supporting other major countries' needs. That energy should come from us. And if it's not coming from us, it's coming from China, India, Russia, places with fewer environmental regulations. Again, emissions, air moves, emissions are shared. It has the exact opposite impact on global emissions. So it's pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I would also point out that it's amazing how the government in Canada never wants to talk about the global picture. I mean, if you just look at the sheer numbers, Canada's emissions are 1.4% of global emissions, thereabouts. And the reality is you have in China new coal plants being open. You have in India the just transition that we have shoved down our industry and our throats in Canada is basically non-existent. And, I remember a few years back or 2 years ago, I spoke to India's petroleum minister, and because he had been on a panel at a global conference in Davos, and he was talking about the need to accelerate the transition. And I asked him on the street after when I ran into him, and he said, oh yeah, I just sort of said that in the room. That's not practical here. So, you have all these other countries that are the beneficiary of Canada really taking aim at its energy sector. And the global emissions picture is not being affected by anything Canada is doing. And even Canadian emissions are not being affected by these things like the carbon tax. Like emissions have gone up.
Yeah, I would say that's where when we look at our emissions reduction goals as a province, we are hitting our targets while production continues to rise. We have decided to take an approach where we work with industry to say, look, what technology exists, what's reasonable, how do we do things better, how do we do things smarter, how can we change our policies but still incentivize industry to do the right thing for the environment. On the flip side, you have Canada just taking a punitive approach, which again, you're exactly right. I mean, it drives investment out. It also drives the production of energy out to other countries. And you're right. Then, at the point where we look at our little piece of the emissions pie, we could shut down all of our major industries, all of them, not just the energy industry. And that emissions reduction space would be eaten up in a very short amount of time by those other countries and that other type of development, like coal, like what we've seen over the last couple of years. And so, I think this is really where Canadians want to see a government that is reasonable, that shows common sense, that isn't really just driven by an ideological activist perspective. And, I think when it comes to these policies, the federal government's approach is just deny, deny, deny. Like, let's not talk about it. Like, Canadians want to talk about the carbon tax. And we have a federal government who just essentially closes their ears and said, yeah, we're not going to listen to that. We're not going to listen to that. And that's why I think they're in free fall in the polls. I think the by-election that we just saw this week, I mean, wild, right? But I think it shows that, what they're saying completely disregards the very real concerns, the everyday concerns of Canadians.
Let me ask you about what you'd like to see moving forward here. And I guess I'll compound this question and ask it in two parts here. Number one, is there a sense that this is just a Guilbeault issue, or is it a Liberal issue, or is it an Ottawa issue? And you're not convinced that, even if there was a change in government, that these problems would go away. And beyond then, what would you like to see? What would you like to see moving forward?
I say all of the time, as a conservative MLA in Alberta, I do believe that a change in government would solve a lot of problems, because we would have a common sense government that cares about, I would say, the needs of everyday Canadians, especially when it comes to affordable and reliable, secure energy. Energy security for our country and for North America is very important. And so these are things that, again, this federal Liberal NDP coalition has completely ignored. And that kind of answers your first question, which, do I think this is a Guilbeault issue? Not solely. Absolutely not. Do I think it's just a Trudeau issue? No, because despite the fact that they're driving this agenda, there's an entire cabinet that's just going along with it. And so, I think that this just shows that the entire Liberal NDP coalition is so wildly out of touch. They say they care about affordability, yet they want to support the carbon tax. They say that, they're listening to everyday Canadians. You know what? Canadians really do care about having access to affordable, reliable electricity and energy. They do. I can tell you they care about it in the middle of summer when it is hot and they need an air conditioner. I can tell you that they care about it in the winter when base load capacity is a very real concern in some provinces. We saw that here in Alberta in January, right? We can't live off of solar and wind when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So I think that this is a bigger issue than just one or two people. This is a complete disregard of everyday Canadians by the Liberal NDP coalition. It just happens to be championed by Stephen Guilbeault and Justin Trudeau right now.
Fair enough. Well, let me just ask you briefly, because I was talking about it before. We had the new NDP leader in your province, Naheed Nenshi, say that he thinks they need a bit of a divorce from the federal NDP. Do you think that will be enough to have the NDP in Alberta taken a bit more seriously by voters?
You know what, I'll tell you this, as a Alberta MLA, when I was door knocking, the number one thing that I heard is how do we see a change in federal government? Enough of Justin Trudeau, enough of the Liberals. And come on, Naheed Nenshi is Justin Trudeau's choice for NDP leadership here in Alberta. I think we've seen that relationship over the last number of years. And so, whether or not they are linked through their bylaws and constitution as a party to to the federal NDP or not. Make no mistake, Nenshi is very much linked in with the federal Liberals, and that's something that I don't think Albertans want to have anything to do with right now.
All right, fair enough. Environment Minister in Alberta, Rebecca Schulz, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
All right, thank you. That does it for us for today. I am off for the rest of the week because that's when the show ends on Thursday and we come back on Monday. But I'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Off the Record. So we'll catch you then. But in the meantime, thank you, God bless, and a good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.